Let's get started. Welcome. Thanks for coming. I am giving a talk called The Ship of Matsumoto, or A Rubyist Takes Stock, the title of which I hope I'll make sense during the talk. Just a little bit about me. David Black. I'm a lead developer at Cyrus Innovation in New York. I started using Ruby in 2000. I am a member of the pickaxe generation, which is to say, I discovered Ruby by discovering the book Programming Ruby by Dave Thomas and Andy Hunt. It's almost 14 years later, haven't looked back. Thank you, Dave, for all you've done. I am also the author of a book, The Well-Grounded Rubyist, which is coming out in a second edition. You can pre-order it even. So, I co-founded and used to direct Ruby Central, which is the parent organization of RubyConf and RailsConf. And thank you for not being at RailsConf. I mean, I do appreciate it. I also do training and I do speaking, and I am proud to say I'm the chief author of one of the standard libraries in Ruby, namely scanf.rb. Did you know Ruby had scanf? No. Yeah, well, it does, thanks to me and Hal Fulton, who wrote it a number of years ago. But enough about me. Let's talk about Ruby. I'll say generally that what prompted this talk, and you'll see this, I think, play out during the talk, is actually kind of the thing at the bottom, the new implementations. They're not all brand new, but they're subsequent to the original implementation. But let's start at the top. Ruby. How many of you are Ruby programmers? Okay, that's about half. Okay, this talk welcomes anyone who is or isn't. Some of this will be familiar to you if you are. Ruby was created by Yukihiro Matsumoto, otherwise known as Mats. The birth date, that's not Mats's birthday, that's Ruby's birthday, was February of 1993. That's when he first announced it. So it's 21 years. We've celebrated the 21st birthday of Ruby this year. Version 1 of Ruby was released at the end of 1996. Ruby was very popular in Japan in the 1990s. And actually, this photograph comes from the 2002 International Ruby Conference in Seattle. So it's 2002, before Rails, before Ruby on Rails, a couple of years after the Pickaxe book. And one of the Japanese Rubyists brought with him from Japan a copy of each and every book then in print about Ruby. And I think there's 23 of them. We took pictures of it at the time. And this was a great lesson. Those of us in the early 2000s who were doing Ruby not in Japan, we learned quickly that Ruby, we didn't discover Ruby. Ruby was already up and running in Japan. We were sort of being welcomed into the community. And this photograph, I think, kind of dramatizes that. There were already a ton of books, even though there were only 2 or 3 maybe by then or outside of Japan. As I mentioned, the Pickaxe book, Programming Ruby, introduced Ruby to a lot of people outside of Japan in late 2000 and thereafter. Ruby was further popularized by the Ruby on Rails web development framework. If some of you used Rails, we have Rails developers? Yeah, okay. Do any of you use Ruby and not Rails? Yeah, oh, okay. People ask me, like, do people do that? And I say, yeah, but I don't meet them very often. But that's cool. Version 2.1 was just released this past Christmas. And Ruby now exists in a number of different implementations. I think Iron Ruby is not a going concern anymore, I think. But the rest of them pretty much are. And there's more that I haven't listed. And really, the impetus for this talk is thinking about Ruby as a kind of central point out of which a kind of hub and spoke model almost. There's Ruby, and then there's these other implementations. And it seems to me we're kind of growing out of the idea of one Ruby. And I'm kind of intrigued, both technically and what I'd call sort of philosophically, by the question of where are we going with Ruby? Is there really one Ruby anymore? Is it sort of splitting out into different languages? Are the languages going to continue to diverge? What does it mean for something to be Ruby, to be an implementation of Ruby? On the technical side, I'm going to talk about two, what I think of as kind of complementary and sort of interactive forces. The centrifugal force, by which I mean things that tend to move away from the idea of one central sort of canonical Ruby. And really, I'm going to talk about 3 Ruby implementations that I think represent, and I don't mean it as, you know, sort of pejorative, like, oh, they're daring to be different from Mats's Ruby, so there's something wrong with them. I think it's actually incredibly productive and exciting that all this stuff is happening. But these I think of as centrifugal, kind of drifting away from the center or moving away from the center. And then there are centripetal forces moving toward the center or kind of tending in the direction of centralizing Ruby. And that includes, for example, RubySpec, which is an enormous test suite designed to help you tell if your implementation is compliant with sort of standard Ruby. And there is actually an ISO standard for Ruby at this point. So you've got, on the one hand, different implementations kind of bursting outward, and on the other hand, in recent years, attempts to standardize Ruby and to define exactly what Ruby is. And again, there's no sort of, you know, criticism implied of either of these. I just find it interesting, and I found it kind of a productive way to look at where Ruby is at and kind of take stock of the landscape. On the reflective side, when we get there, I want to talk about a little bit about the paradox of the Ship of Theseus, kind of translated into terms for Ruby. And question, you know, we don't have to get too deep dish about it, but questions like, are other Rubies really Ruby? What's exactly happening with the language? Are we reaching a point where, sort of like Lisp, where there's dialects, are we reaching that point where there's dialects of Ruby and we can talk about Rubies the way we talk about Lisps and so on? So we'll get to some of that, but I wanted to start with some of the technical points. Again, just to give you a flavor of kind of what's going on, where we're at a little bit, and just demonstrate a few things. So we'll start with mRuby, which is a small Ruby interpreter. It's a subset of MRI. MRI is Mats's Ruby interpreter, which it's what we used to call Ruby before there were other Ruby interpreters, right? It's sort of the main development branch of Ruby and release branch of Ruby. So mRuby is a subset of MR, and mRuby is headed up by Mats also. It's sort of his more recent kind of pet project. It's compatible with Ruby 1.9. It conforms to a subset of the standard. It doesn't cover the entire language, but it does try to conform to what it does cover. It's embeddable in C, and I'm going to show just a couple of little demonstrations of this. And in theory, at least, embeddable in machines via C. By the way, I don't know, I found the word embed to be kind of overloaded. I was scratching my head a little as I was kind of researching. Like, you embed Ruby in C, but you embed C in a device. So you can do all of this with mRuby, apparently. It's still in its early days. Version 1 was just released in February. If you want more information, there's a website, and also Googling will get you somewhere. All right, we're gonna have a little demo, or really just a sort of show and tell with regard to mRuby, which I believe is in this tab, okay. So, what we have here is the basic git checkout of mRuby, plus a few files that I stuck in here for convenience. I haven't, my demo files are kind of scattershot. They're just kind of dropped in here. I didn't do a lot of directory structuring. One example I have is actually taken directly, cut and pasted. Did anyone else hear that? Or is it just me? Okay, good. Right, so this example is just cut and pasted from the URL at the top. And what we've got here is essentially Ruby inside C. So you have your main function, you create an MRB state pointer, and you have a string, a character array, and you load the string, or you call this load string function, and it actually executes the code. So, by way of evidence of this, we're going to, yes, build, got my whole little build outfit going here. So that build.sh, by the way, just looks like that. Build host lib is where when you compile mruby, that's where it puts its libraries. So now we have a program called mr. And sure enough, it prints out Ruby is awesome 5 times. And again, just to show you the code again, it looks like this. So I got to thinking, what if you have a separate file? And I did this, there are kind of 2 ways to do this. There's sort of the home-brewed way, which is what, I don't mean homebrew like the utility, I mean the home, homemade way, which I'll show you, and then I'll show you the more official way to integrate files and combine Ruby and C. But my first little experiment I will show you, which was something called readin, just my name for it. Except I want to look at it, I don't want to run it. So what I did here was, I was just curious about reading in just a Ruby file, just a Ruby source file. So I have a file called person.rb, and I'll actually show you person.rb. So person.rb up at the top is just a little dinky Ruby class that has class person. It has 2 attributes, name and age. You initialize name and age, it stores them, that's all it does. So that's in a file called person.rb. So what I did was I opened person.rb, get the size of person.rb, allocate the memory for a character array of that size +1 to have the final 0, and I read it in. By the way, there's no, I believe in mruby there's no require statement. There should be, and as I'll show you, there are more sort of official ways to do this, but I went pretty low level here because I don't think there's any kind of simpler way to read in a file, so I did it this way. And then my string that I'm going to execute is David equals person new, name and age, and then put as David is X years old based on the person. So here we have, whoops, it's mr readin, and sure enough, it works. So again, you see kind of integrating Ruby into C using this small interpreter. Okay, now the official way to do this, you can certainly do what, it's a Ruby interpreter, you can do whatever you want with it, but the official way to do it is through this built-in kind of gems subsystem that they give you in mruby. So here, for example, we have inside examples, we have something called MRB gems. And MRB gems includes something called C and Ruby extension example. And that includes certain sort of canonical directories. The MRB lib directory is where you put your Ruby source. The source directory is where you put your C source. And then you go into buildconfig.rb and you say conf.gem and the name of your gem. So you're actually going to compile mruby to know about your kind of sub-libraries, which are packaged as these kind of mini gems. So we're going to actually build the whole, whoops, actually they want you to do this, mini rake. That just built, I think it was already built, so it was kind of fast, but that just built and outputted everything, and it lists the included gems, which include C and Ruby extension example. So C and Ruby extension example, we have a swap file, do we? Let's edit anyway. Okay, I have actually changed this up a little bit. It's not exactly as it came out of the box, because as it came out of the box, it had a class method, and I added an instance method because I just wanted some practice doing that. So what we've got, and sorry, the wrapping of this probably makes it hard to read, but I don't want to make it a lot smaller for the sake of the people in the back. But basically, if you've seen Ruby source code, the source code of the Ruby language, some of this will be pretty familiar, or kind of the overall look and feel. But it's a little bit different. There's actually a puts function now in C, so you can just do that as if it were Ruby. And down here, I've bound the method, the first method that's called C method, I bound as a class method to this class C extension, or C Ruby extension. And then my instance method, which I added to the example, I bound to I method using the MRB define method function. So I take my MRB object, which is an MRB state pointer. That's kind of the focal object for doing most of these operations. I take class C extension, which is a class. I've defined the class up here. So this is actually a pointer to an R class struct. I give the name of the method, the function that it's going to that's going to underlie it, and then and then no arguments. And sure enough, if I now run, we're going to run the little IRB that comes with mruby, and I say little because it doesn't have read line, it doesn't have tab memory and so on. But this created a class called C Ruby extension, right? That's right there. So if I say C Ruby extension dot C method, I get a C extension, which is what that method outputs. If I say C Ruby extension dot new dot I method, it says an instance method. So that's just the mechanics of how you can incorporate your little or big or whatever, your add-ons, your gems, into mruby itself. You have them in the directory and you compile the thing, you build the thing, and it will actually find, assuming you list them in the configuration file, it will find them, compile them, and they'll be part of the running interpreter. All right. So mruby, again, it's a little bit centrifugal. It's a new-ish implementation. I mean, it uses a lot of the code from MRI, but it's kind of dedicated to new purposes. But again, it's not sort of wildly out there. It conforms to the standard. Again, it's a kind of subset of the ISO standard. And it's under the control of Mats, or the development of Mats, so it's pretty official, and I think it's pretty cool. All right, Ruby Motion, another venture in moving kind of beyond traditional Ruby or default Ruby, if I can call it that. Have any of you used Ruby Motion? A couple of you, a few of you. Do any of you do iOS development? A few more of you, not too, okay. So basically Ruby Motion is for iOS and OS 10 application development. It's a completely new implementation of Ruby that is built on the Objective-C runtime. So actually the Ruby that you write is really kind of Objective-C in Ruby clothing. So Ruby classes become Objective-C classes, Ruby methods become Objective-C functions, and so on. What this does is it basically lets people who want to do iOS development do it in Ruby, but have all the speed advantages of Objective-C, because it's kind of a thin translation layer down to Objective-C. I actually did about a year ago a bunch of Ruby Motion. We had kind of a flurry at Cyrus where I work. We had sort of a flurry of Ruby Motion work. I haven't kept up with it that much. I did reinstall it. I did repurchase the license to make sure I was up to date for the talk. One of the effects of which was the actual Ruby Motion binary interpreter crashes when I try to run it, but I have to talk to the Ruby Motion people and figure out why that is. I might need to update to Mavericks or something. But my demo, I think, will make the point. It's just kind of hello world demo. But anyway, before the demo, I want to talk a little bit about how Ruby Motion accommodates Objective-C syntax and sort of departs from Ruby syntax in a couple of interesting ways. Specifically, in RubyMotion, you define typically a method. If you look at that, I've defined, or I shouldn't say this comes from the example subdirectory in the RubyMotion GitHub account itself. But basically, you can see there's 3 definitions of a method called outline view. And typically in Ruby, if you define something 3 times, you end up with just the last one prevailing, because whichever is the last one sort of knocks out the others. So the last one defined is the one that wins. Here, if you just look at the def outline view, it looks like you've got 3 definitions and 2 of them are just going to be discarded. But in fact, what's happening is the Ruby syntax here maps to Objective-C selectors, which are based on essentially these kind of keyword structures. So when I call, for example, outline view, and I give it an argument of outline view, and then I give it this number of children of item : item, I'm actually sending to the object, this is equivalent in Ruby, I'm sending to the object a message that is outline view number of children of item, outline view : number of children of item. So the method is actually called that, and it's sort of syntactic sugared into what it looks like up there. And this maps to Objective-C selectors that use kind of similar semantics. Now, one thing I find interesting, and I did talk last year a little bit to the RubyMotion creator about this. I'm not sure what his current thinking is about it, but have some of you looked at keyword arguments in Ruby 2? You may notice that this looks a lot like, these kinds of things in this method call look a lot like keyword arguments. They're not identical, but enough so that I'm not sure what RubyMotion is going to do about ever supporting keyword arguments. It would be slightly different syntax, but it's basically taking the keyword argument semantics from Objective-C and putting it in Ruby rather than the Ruby, what we now have, the Ruby keyword argument semantics, and using that. Which, again, it's not sort of good or bad or whatever. It's just kind of an interesting example of it sort of moving past the canonical Ruby. But it's actually a really cool system, I think. When I was working in it, I enjoyed it a lot. So let's just look at a little kind of hello world example called hi. I called it hi instead of hello or whatever because in my RubyMotion directory I already had one called hello, and that was an old one, and I wanted to create a brand new one, so I called it hi. All right, drum roll please, rake. There we go. So that's actually an iOS simulator over there. This is obviously a very simple example, but if I say, I have to hit up arrow so I don't have to actually remember what I typed. Okay, if I have a UI alert view object, whoops, not by, right? And I show it, it will change the message. So you can do that sort of in real time, interactive. Again, very simple example, but it comes with that toolkit. You can develop using Xcode, or you can develop just using a text editor. It doesn't, either one will work. What are we near? A kitchen, I guess? Something like that. That sounded like silverware. All right. Okay, I wanted to say a little bit about a third project called Rubinius X. I have to admit, Rubinius X is a little bit of a mystery to me because, honestly, I will confess this, I couldn't get it to compile. Has anyone gotten this to compile? Anyone tried this? I'm in the middle of it, and I got caught up short, meaning I haven't succeeded yet. It's a fork of Rubinius, which is an older project. Rubinius itself is Ruby mostly written in Ruby, sort of bootstrapped with C++ and then mostly written in Ruby. Rubinius X, I struggled with Git. I was trying to, I looked up the error I got. It said, yeah, get tag 226. I said fetch tags, check out tag 226. Nothing seemed to work. So that's on hold at the moment. But I have a couple of comments anyway and a couple of things to point out. And someday I'll actually get it running and see how far they've gotten with their experiment. It is called, this is quoting from the website, an experiment in modernizing Ruby. Now that's a little bit, I don't know, a little bit of a kind of backhanded, you know, sort of, oh, I guess Ruby's not very modern. But actually they make an interesting case for some ways in which Ruby is, you know, arguably in need of more sort of modern semantics and engineering in terms of concurrency and certain other things. So the idea of Rubinius X is to enable us to write modern programs now in Ruby, and the sort of secondary idea, or the kind of implied idea, is to make Ruby more appealing to businesses that might otherwise be looking at other languages, and not to allow Ruby to kind of lag behind. Now, one result of this is that Rubinius X really isn't supposed to be identical to Ruby. It is a, you know, sort of a dialect or something. But one example of this, at least I think this example is accurate. Let's say, all right, it's defining operations in terms of primitives, as the headline says. Let's say you have a hash in Ruby, and you define on that hash the key setting or pair setting method bracket equals. And let's say you define it so it does, you hook into it. You don't just set the key to the value. You also log it, or you serialize it to YAML or something, right? I'm thinking of something a little bit like Perl tie. I don't know if any of you have used Perl and tie, but where you sort of do a little bit of engineering and all your get and set operations sort of flow through code you've written. So let's say you then merge another hash into this hash. When you think of defining operations in terms of primitives, assuming that the bracket equals is considered a primitive, which I think it would be in this context, then when you merge a hash, you'll actually get that method called. So when you merge this hash, it will do the interesting thing like logging or serializing or whatever. In other words, everything sort of flows through this one method, the bracket equals method. This doesn't happen in Ruby. In Ruby, these methods are mostly defined separately for various reasons, including performance and optimization. So you can redefine the bracket equals method, but in Ruby, when you merge a hash into a hash, it doesn't call bracket equals. It has a separate definition for merge that does something else. It doesn't all sort of flow through one checkpoint. So you can't guarantee that something like serialization or logging will even take place. Now this is of interest to me because as early as 2001, after I'd been using Ruby for about 2 or 3 months, I clung to I'd been using Perl a lot, and Perl has this tie facility, as I mentioned. I clung to this idea. I didn't get it, basically, in 2001. I didn't get that redefining bracket equals wouldn't actually mean that when you merge or do some other thing that doesn't actually use bracket equals, that I didn't get that it wouldn't trigger bracket equals. I thought if I want every hash call to magically persist to YAML or whatever, you know, to serialize and persist the hash, just turn it into a kind of, you know, persisted database automatically. I thought, well, yeah, just, you know, there's a hash setter method, bracket equals, I'll just redefine that, and then whenever I add to this hash, it'll serialize it and so on. As I say, it doesn't work in Ruby, and this is just me on Ruby, on the Ruby Talk mailing list a million years ago, sort of thrashing a little bit and saying, why can't I do this? It's so easy in Perl. So this had an echo. When I read this thing about defining operations in terms of primitives in Rubinius X, it kind of echoed with me because it was like, oh yeah, that's the thing I wanted Ruby to be able to do in 2001, and it can't. So keep an eye on this project. As I said, I'm still on the learning curve of it and getting it to compile and build, but I think it's very interesting. All right, we've been talking about what I referred to as centrifugal activities. That is, those centrifugal meaning tending away from the center. So if you think of MRI as the center of Ruby and these other projects kind of, in one way or another, kind of moving away from the center, doing something a little bit different. There's also centripetal forces at work in the Ruby world. And I'm thinking specifically of RubySpec and the ISO standard. Now, I'll say up front, I have not purchased the ISO standard, so I've never actually seen. Has anyone actually seen the ISO standard for Ruby? I'm really intrigued. I have to see if I can. It's too late for Christmas. Well, whatever. Anyway, someday I'd actually like to see it, but I kind of know what the gist of it, what it does. But unfortunately, I don't have it to show to you. RubySpec is a big spec framework, or well, a big set of specs or tests designed to help you understand whether your implementation of Ruby is conformant to kind of standard Ruby. And RubySpec has some traction and is actually pretty big. And you do hear about implementers trying to get their implementation to pass RubySpec. Again, not all of them will, because some of them are deliberately doing things that Ruby doesn't do, either in terms of syntax or in terms of semantics or whatever. But RubySpec, for those that do adhere to it, it's very informative. I just have here a page or two of example of RubySpec, just taken right, literally kind of connected to the GitHub account here. So here, this, for example, is arrayspec.rb from the language subdirectory. And it's basically a bunch of RSpec specs. Although I believe they created a sort of fork of RSpec, or an add-on for RSpec that is specific to this suite. That was the word I was trying to think of, this suite of specs. But I'm not going to get too much into the technical details on that end. I just wanted to just give you a kind of the flavor of what it's doing. So if you look at, for instance, brackets should return a new array populated with the given elements, that's, one's first reaction is, well, duh, right? That's what that bracket does in Ruby. But of course, the point of this is to make sure that an implementation is in strict conformity with the expectations of the language standard, or the standard language. So array equals 1, a nil. It should be kind of array, meaning that should be its class. Array sub 0 should be 1, and so forth, sort of walking through the whole thing. The second one, I'm not going to go through all of these, obviously, but just, again, to give you kind of the flavor. The second one, empty expressions treated as nil elements. I've never seen empty parentheses in an array, but I'm kind of impressed that they thought of that, which is sort of an edge case, but there it is. So those get treated as nil, and again, it walks through the whole array and figures out what should be what. Just the third one, it accepts a literal hash without curly braces as its only parameter. You don't have to put the braces around the hash if that's all that's in your array. Just a little syntactic sugar from Ruby, and so forth. So RubySpec, again, I think of it as sort of centripetal, sort of seeking the center. It's tending to centralize Ruby, while some of these other projects are kind of moving outward in various ways. All right, any questions on the technical side before I get into the reflective side? Which has kind of been present implicitly all along, but I do have a few things to say about this. First of all, when I was thinking about this question of there's different Rubies, and what makes an implementation be Ruby or not be Ruby, and is that sort of a meaningful concept or a useful concept or not? I got to thinking about the Ship of Theseus. Have some of you come across this ancient paradox before? The Ship of Theseus paradox involves a kind of thought experiment where you think, you think of a ship, a wooden ship, and imagine that one plank at a time is removed and replaced with something else, with a different plank. And at what point, if any, does it become a different ship? Right? Now, it's not an absolute analogy for what's happening with Rubies, but it kind of got me thinking about if you take a language and you kind of replace certain things in it or do certain things differently, at what point does it become a different language? Is it, is it still Ruby? Is it something else? And in other words, do some of these centrifugal activities raise Ship of Theseus-esque questions? And again, without, I don't know that I have an answer, but, I sort of meditate a little on what is the essence of Ruby or of a Ruby. Should we be very strict about something like the ISO standard or RubySpec? Is it time to just sort of let go and say there's no one true Ruby? Ruby is sort of a general sort of engineering direction that we go in, but it's not a specific, absolutely kind of rigidly defined language. And I think of Ruby in comparison with Lisp or C, for example, where you have, Scheme and Emacs Lisp and Common Lisp and all these dialects and so on that are sort of Lisps. So in a sense, I think we have what amount to Rubies in the same sense. And also C, you could say, with Objective-C and C++ and C# and Java and whatever, that there are things that are kind of, based around C in one way or another, but aren't C, or are not, sort of ANSI C. I don't have an absolute answer to this. I just wanted to take you on a tour of my current thinking about it. Hello. I think, in fact, for my money, I don't know. I think I used to be a little bit either conservative or sort of territorial about Ruby. I think I used to react not really negatively, but a little bit eyebrow-raising to new Ruby projects like Rubinius that were not, that were kind of supersets of Ruby or that modified Ruby syntax in certain ways. I've loosened up a lot about that, partly just out of admiration for the people who are doing that work. I mean, I think it's just really cool that there's these different implementations, and I can't claim to have been very, involved with any of them. So, I kind of take my hat off to the people doing that work. And I think also encouraged by Mats, who has always been very excited about other implementations. He sets that example that we're not sort of rigid about there's this kind of one true Ruby and nobody else dare do anything about it. And I think I've moved more in that direction. I don't think I was terribly rigid, but I think I have loosened up a little about that. So I see it as a very exciting landscape. In the end, it's, it may or may not matter what we come up with sort of philosophically, because the snowball keeps going, and that's good, right? Things keep happening, things keep being built, keep being designed, and that's all to the good. But anyway, as I said, I had a few thoughts about it, and I thought I would just share them with you today. And that's about it from me. I'm happy to entertain questions, comments. How short did I fall? Could be worse. Yes?
In Ruby, it seems that it would have a faster startup time and maybe less memory usage. Is the execution speed any faster?
What did I just, the question is the execution speed of mRuby any faster than MRI? I just read something, a very specific example, and now I can't remember what it was. It may have been some regex matching or something where it was faster. and I can't remember what it was, just in the last 24 hours, but I can't remember. I think it's, yeah, the startup time should be pretty quick. I mean, it's designed to be this kind of lightweight, embeddable, minimalist interpreter. I don't know, to the extent that it kind of shares code with MRI, it may be kind of comparable in performance, but it leaves out a lot. The main trimming down is for the memory size, kind of the memory footprint for the interpreter itself. Anything else? Questions, comments? Yes?
I'm curious, this sounds like a snarky comment, so I don't want it to. I'm curious. What is the point, so to speak, of Ruby motion? Ruby motion is just like a thin layer above Objective-C. Is it just like, I don't like Objective-C syntax, and so I want to write Ruby-like syntax? Or is there something, is there a bigger advantage to it?
Yeah, no, it's I think that's pretty much it. The idea that if you love Ruby and you want to develop iOS applications, now you get to do that because there's Ruby Motion. And it has an ancestry, which has been explained to me, though I don't remember it all in great detail, through Mac Ruby and other projects that didn't quite last. But this kind of got some traction and some interest. And but yeah, I think mainly it's for if you love Ruby, it's to attract Ruby developers to that and give you an alternative to Objective-C, which I appreciate when I was doing it, and I will do it again too, but I certainly appreciated that. Dave?
I'm really so glad you asked that question, because I think that's a really dangerous thing. That we produce a version of Ruby, which, as you say, is really just a very, very thin shim. Objective-C and that whole runtime. Which means you actually have to understand the entire runtime anyway.
True.
Two things, not one thing. And the excuse for it is, as you said, it's for people that like Ruby. Well, if there are people who like Ruby so much that they have to learn two things in one thing, then they should probably not like Ruby in the first place. I really am nervous about this kind of monoculture that can develop when people say, oh, I'm a Ruby programmer. And if you want me to write OS X, then I'm going to write Ruby. Right? That's crazy. Absolutely crazy. I think that you can choose the right tool for the job. And I've never ever understood the motivation behind Ruby. Now, the stuff that Rich Kilman was doing was very different. When he built this little map into that really beautiful abstraction for building OS X APIs. Now we've lost that. It's just back down to very, very dark tools. I think it's a really valid question. One should be asking.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, when I was doing Ruby Motion last year, as I mentioned, there was kind of a flurry of it where I worked. Yeah, I mean, I never fully kind of wrestled with that question, maybe. I mean, there was something very enjoyable about it. I mean, partly, in my case, it was partly that I'd been doing Ruby on Rails, which I love, but basically every Ruby project I'd done for 9 years was Rails. And so Ruby Motion came along and my company was kind of encouraging us to learn it, and we got some clients in it and so on. So just in sort of anecdotal terms, I mean, for me, it was a lot of fun because, I have no objection to Objective-C. I don't know Objective-C, so I can't, I'm not sort of dissing Objective-C in any way. But no, I think that's actually a really interesting point, that you do have to learn a lot about the runtime. You can't just sort of do it with blinders on as if it's just Ruby. And again, even the example that I showed, there's different syntax, different semantics, and so on. And you do end up learning something about Objective-C without necessarily becoming an Objective-C programmer, and that may be kind of an adulterated way to go about it, indeed. Anything else? All right, thank you very much. See you around the conference. Okay, thanks.